Okay, so you know how every single day you're facing all these challenges, right? Big ones, little ones, just kind of keeps coming at you. And what if there was a better way, a more effective way to deal with all that, to really get ahead of the game? And that's what we're going to really dive into today. It's like your own personal strategy session, just for you to really help you get ahead.
Yeah, and we're going to be looking at a really fundamental principle. And when you actually understand it and apply it, this can shift you from, constantly just reacting to stuff to like anticipating what's going to happen, from struggling with things to actually strategizing and getting on top of it.
Exactly. And today we're doing a deep dive on strategy number 13 from the 33 Strategies of War. It's called Know Your Enemy, the Intelligence Strategy. Now, when we say enemy, don't get all hung up on like picturing a battlefield or something. Think of it more broadly, like anything you're trying to overcome could be a tough competitor in business or a really tricky negotiation you're trying to figure out, or even just like a personal hurdle you're trying to get over. And so the goal today is to pull out the most useful and powerful insights from this strategy and really equip you to go after those challenges and give you a real edge.
I think it's so interesting how often we see people just jump right into situations without really even stopping to think about what they're dealing with or who they're dealing with.
Oh, yeah.
And this strategy is all about taking a pause. Like just observe what's going on,
Right.
really understand before you do anything.
We've all been there, right? You just
Yes.
charge in with like a solution and then you realize, oh, wait, I didn't actually understand the problem in the first place.
Yeah.
So this is about giving you those tools to observe, to analyze, to really see things clearly, and that gives you the foresight to know what to do. So where do we even start with something this big? It's like we need a historical basis or something to anchor us.
Absolutely. I think a great starting point is with Sun Tzu and all the wisdom he laid out in The Art of War.
And see, it's like his insights are just timeless, right?
Yeah.
Still apply today. And there's one quote I always think about. He says, if you know the enemy and know yourself, you need not fear the result of 100 battles.
hmm
It's so simple, but it's so powerful.
And I think what's so important to understand about Sun Tzu is that his focus is always on winning before anything even starts, before any confrontation. His whole approach wasn't about brute force. It was about being smart about it, gathering information, knowing how to deceive when necessary, and being completely prepared. And it was always about winning, but with the least amount of effort.
So it wasn't about just having the biggest army then.
Right? Not just about that. His armies, they were masters of figuring out what the enemy was doing. They were constantly analyzing how the enemy troops were set up, looking for any weak points, anything they could take advantage of. Maybe one side wasn't well defended, or they relied too much on one supply line, and then they'd use that to their advantage to strike precisely where it hurt.
So instead of just like clashing head on, it was more about knowing the battlefield and the enemy so well that you were setting traps, kind of making the actual fight almost a done deal.
Exactly. The real victory was knowing everything beforehand, knowing the terrain and the enemy's moves so well that the battle was basically just wrapping things up.
Wow. So knowledge itself was like the ultimate weapon. You're winning in your mind before swords even come out.
Exactly. And Robert Greene takes these old principles and really expands on them, and gives us ways to use them in modern times.
Okay, so what are some of the benefits Greene talks about?
Well, first he talks about control. When you truly understand how your opponent operates, like their habits, their reactions, their tendencies, you start to see patterns. And when you can see those patterns, you can predict what they're going to do. It's like watching someone play poker and you start to recognize their tells.
So instead of just reacting to what they throw at you, you're already one step ahead.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And the second thing is, knowing your opponent deeply exposes their weak points. Nobody's perfect. Every person, every organization, every strategy has flaws. So if you're really digging for information, you're going to find those vulnerabilities, those pressure points that you can use to your advantage.
Finding those cracks in their armor.
Right. And then third, a complete understanding of your opponent lets you avoid walking into traps. You're not going in blind anymore. You have a map of the dangers, so you can chart a course that keeps you safe and helps you get where you need to be.
It's like having that strategic foresight. You're the one with all the information. You're the one in control.
That's right.
Okay, so this all sounds great in theory, but how does this actually play out in the real world? In ways that our listeners can connect with and use.
That's a great question. Let's look at some real-world examples.
Yeah.
In the business world, think about those startups that do all that market research before they launch a new product. They're not just looking at who they're competing against. They're trying to understand what customers really need. what new technology is coming out and where there are gaps in the market that nobody's filling. This is intelligence gathering, and it helps them offer something unique, something that people actually want.
So it's like they're getting a bird's eye view of the whole landscape before they even start building anything.
Exactly. Then you've got leadership roles in politics or business.
Yeah.
Really good leaders, they can often just read their rivals.
Hmm.
They understand what makes them tick, what their goals are, who their allies are, and where they're vulnerable. And this lets them anticipate what's coming and come up with counter strategies.
It's like this high-stakes game of chess where you're always trying to outmaneuver each other.
Right. And even in our personal lives, just taking the time to really understand the people around us, their perspectives, what motivates them, how they react to things. This can be so helpful when you disagree with someone, when you're trying to build stronger relationships or just trying to get along better with people.
So it's not just for big strategic battles, it's for everyday life, too.
Absolutely. Now let's talk about a specific company, Apple. They're known for how well they do their research and understand the market.
Yeah, Apple, it seems like they almost never make a wrong move.
Well, no company's perfect,
Huh?
but a lot of their success comes from how much they prepare. Before they come out with a big new product, there's this intense period where they gather all kinds of information. They're not just looking at what their competitors are already doing, they're going deeper. They're trying to figure out how consumers behave, what trends are coming up, and what needs aren't being met. They're asking, what problems do people have that nobody's solved yet?
So they're not just reacting to the competition. They're trying to figure out what people really want, even if they don't say it out loud.
Right. And because they understand all this, they can time their releases perfectly. Often they'll enter a market with a product that completely changes the game because it addresses these deeper needs that nobody else was paying attention to.
Yeah.
So all this careful research has helped them be innovative and stay on top.
So the big lesson here is that if you understand the whole picture, not just the players right in front of you, you're going to make much better decisions.
Okay, so for our listener, what are some concrete things they can start doing right now to adopt this know your enemy mindset in their everyday life?
The most important thing is to really make a conscious effort to observe things before you do anything. Resist that urge to just jump into a negotiation or a conflict or even a new project without taking the time to really assess what's going on and who's involved.
It's like we have to intentionally hit the pause button on our instinct to just react.
Exactly. And Greene has this really important warning about overconfidence.
Well, that's something we can all fall into, I think. Tell me more about that. It's so easy to think you already know enough, to assume you've got your opponent figured out, any of their intentions, the whole situation. But that's exactly when you can get blindsided because someone else did their homework better than you. Gathering intel is not a one-time thing. It's a constant process. Things change, and you have to keep learning and updating your understanding as you go.
It's true. It's easy to get complacent and then boom, you're caught off guard. We talked about the Allied forces in World War II during D-Day earlier. Can we unpack that a little more? I think it's a great example of how intelligence played such a key role.
It's really remarkable. In the time leading up to D-Day, the Allies gathered a massive amount of intelligence about the German defenses along the Normandy coast. I mean, they studied everything. The exact locations of artillery guns, machine gun nests, the types of troops, the terrain, even the tides.
I can't even imagine trying to put all that information together.
It was a huge undertaking. And the key was that they didn't just collect this information, they used it to create their strategy. They came up with really clever deception campaigns to mislead the Germans. They fed them false information to make them think the invasion was going to happen somewhere else. This was so important because it meant the German defenses were weaker at the actual landing sites.
So it wasn't just about knowing where the enemy was strong. It was about tricking them into thinking they needed to be strong in the wrong place.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's strategic manipulation at its best. And there's no doubt that D-Day, which was a major turning point in the war, was successful because of this intelligence advantage and the careful planning it made possible. It was a victory that was won before the first troops even landed on the beaches.
That's a powerful example of how important it is to gather information thoroughly and then use it strategically. But as the strategy itself says, it's not enough to just collect information, right?
You're right. There's a danger in getting stuck in what's called analysis paralysis. You get so focused on getting information, you never actually do anything with it. The information you get only matters if you use it to create a plan and then act on it. Don't just keep observing forever. You have to make a strategy and put it into action.
So it's about finding that sweet spot between knowing enough to make a smart decision and then having the guts to actually do something.
Exactly. And then you have the opposite problem, which is just as dangerous, ignoring important information or underestimating it. And a really good example of this is Napoleon's invasion of Russia.
Oh, yeah, a classic case of overconfidence getting in the way of clear thinking.
Totally. So Napoleon, he had tons of reports about how brutal the Russian winter was and how difficult it would be to move an army across such a huge area. But he basically ignored it all. He was just too confident in his army, he thought they could easily take over Moscow.
He underestimated his enemy. And in this case, it wasn't just the Russian army, it was the whole country in the weather.
You got it. And because he didn't listen to the information he had, his once unstoppable army got completely destroyed by the winter. Their supply lines were cut off, and the Russians kept fighting back. This was a major turning point for Napoleon, and it all happened because he didn't pay attention to what he knew.
It just goes to show that even the most powerful people can fall when they ignore reality.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, so let's bring this back to our listeners. What are some concrete steps they can take right now to start using this know your enemy strategy?
Here's what I recommend. First, make a conscious effort to really study your competitors, your rivals, whoever you're up against, or even just the challenges you're facing.
Hmm.
Figure out their strengths, their weaknesses, what they typically do. Second, pay close attention to how people actually behave. Don't just listen to what they say, watch what they do. Actions speak louder than words.
Show, don't tell, right?
Right. Third, be patient. Don't rush into making decisions or doing something until you've gathered enough information and you really understand the situation.
So it's about being more thoughtful and analytical.
Absolutely. Fourth, don't ever think you have all the answers. Always be open to new information and be willing to change your mind as you learn more. And lastly, think about using deception strategically. Sometimes, if you mislead your opponent carefully, you can create opportunities and throw them off balance.
It's like creating your own fog of war.
Exactly.
We talked about traditional businesses earlier. Can you give us an example of this strategy being used in today's digital world?
Sure. Think about those big tech companies like Google and Facebook. They're constantly doing massive amounts of research. They collect and analyze huge amounts of data about what users do online, how they interact with each other, and what trends are emerging. And all this information helps them predict what users are going to want in the future.
Yeah.
Helps them stay ahead of the competition and keep their position at the top when it comes to things like targeted advertising and new technology.
So in today's world, data is like the ultimate weapon for a lot of these companies.
In a lot of ways, yes. Because they're so good at gathering, analyzing, and using this data, they have a big advantage that's really hard to beat.
Okay, so as we start to wrap up this deep dive into the intelligence strategy, what's the key takeaway for our listeners? What's the main point we want them to remember?
I think the most important thing to remember is that when you truly understand something, you have power. If you really commit to studying things carefully, observing and analyzing what you see, you're going to have a much better chance of succeeding no matter what you're doing, whether it's business, personal relationships, or just personal challenges. Knowledge is the key.
So resist that urge to just jump in and do something. Instead, become a student of the situation and the people involved.
Exactly. So here's a question for you, our listeners, something to really think about as you face your own challenges. Next time you're up against a big obstacle or a competitor, ask yourself, do I really understand what's going on here? Do I understand the other people involved? Or am I just moving forward based on assumptions and incomplete information?
Take a moment and really be honest with yourself before you dive in. And what's one thing they can do right now to start putting these ideas into practice?
Pick a challenge you're dealing with right now. But instead of trying to solve it right away, take some time to just gather information. Research the other people involved. Look at what they've done in the past. Look for patterns in how they act and try to understand why they do what they do. You might be surprised by what you learn and how it changes your whole approach.
That's great advice. Know your enemy, whether it's a competitor, a challenge, or something within yourself. And when you do that, you're way more likely to come out on top.